everyone, Erin here, librarian from the Central Library, and it's time for our classic children's literature read aloud. Now, on Monday, we finished off The Wizard of Oz, and next Monday, we'll start another book. But before that, just to break up things a little bit, I thought between stories we'd read a fairy tale or two. So, the one I'm going to read today and Friday, we are going to read The Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen. So, hope everyone is sitting comfortably, and let's get started. The Snow Queen, which tells of the mirror and its fragments. There was once a wicked troll who was more wicked than anybody else. One day he was in a very happy frame of mind, for he had just constructed a mirror which made everything good and beautiful shrink up to nothing when it was reflected in it. But all those things that were ugly and useless were magnified and made to appear 10 times worse than before. In this mirror, the loveliest landscapes looked like boiled spinach, and the handsomest persons appeared odious, and their features were so distorted that their friends could never have recognized them. Moreover, if one of them had a freckle, it seemed to spread right over his nose and mouth, and if a good or pious thought glanced across his mind, a wrinkle was seen in the mirror. The troll thought all this was highly entertaining, and he chuckled with delight at his clever invention. Those who studied at the school of magic where he taught spread abroad the fame of this wonderful mirror, and said that for the first time the world and its inhabitants could be seen as they really were. They carried the mirror from place to place, until at last there was no country or person that had not been misrepresented in it. Then they flew up to the sky with it, to see if they could carry on their sport there. But the higher they flew, the more wrinkled the mirror became, and they could scarcely hold it together. They flew on, higher and higher, till at last the mirror trembled so fearfully that it escaped from their hands and fell to the earth, breaking into 1,000,000 billion little pieces. And then it caused far greater unhappiness than before, for fragments of it scarcely as large as a grain of sand flew about in the air, and got into people's eyes, making them see everything the wrong way, and have eyes only for what was perverted and corrupt, for each little fragment retained the peculiar properties of the whole mirror. Some people were unfortunate enough to get a little splinter into their hearts, and that was disastrous, for their heart became cold and hard, like a lump of ice. Some pieces were large enough to be used as window panes, but it was no use looking at one's friends through panes like these. Other fragments were made into spectacles, and did much harm to everybody who put them on. The wicked troll was greatly amused with this, and he laughed till his sides ached. Some little splinters of this mischievous mirror are still flying about in the air, and we shall hear more about them very soon. The first story, A Little Boy and a Little Girl. In a large town, where there were so many houses and inhabitants that there was not enough room for everybody to have a little garden of their own, and many people had to be content with keeping a few plants in pots, there dwelt 2 poor children whose garden was somewhat larger than a flower pot. They were not brother and sister, but they loved each other just as much as if they had been, and their parents lived in 2 attics which were exactly opposite each other. The roof of one house nearly joined the other, the gutter ran along between them, and there was a little window in each roof, so that you could stride across the gutter from one window to the other. The parents of each child had a large wooden box in which they grew herbs for the kitchen, and they put these boxes on the gutter, so that they almost touched each other. A beautiful little rose tree grew in each box. Scarlet runners entwined their long shoots over the windows, and, uniting with the branches of the rose trees, formed a flowery arch over the street. The boxes were very high, and the children knew they weren't allowed to climb over them, but they often used to sit on their little stools under the rose trees, and thus they passed many a delightful hour. When winter came, this wasn't possible anymore. The windows were often frozen over, and then they heated a halfpenny on the stove, held the warm copper against the frozen pane, and thus made a little round peephole through which they could see each other. The little boy was called Kay, and the little girl's name was Gerda. In summer they could get out of the window and jump over to each other, but in winter there were stairs to run down and stairs to run up, and sometimes outside the wind roared and the snow fell. "Those are the white bees swarming there," said the old grandmother. "Have they a queen bee?" asked the little boy, for he knew that real bees have one. "They have," said the grandmother. "She flies about over there where they swarm so thickly. She is the largest of them all, and she never stays on the earth, but flies up again into the black cloud. Sometimes on a winter's night she goes through the streets of the town and breathes with her frosty breath on the windows, covering them with strange and beautiful forms like trees and flowers." "Yes, I have seen them," said both the children, so they knew that this was true. "Can the Snow Queen come in here?" asked the little girl. "If she comes in," said the boy, "I'll put her on the hot stove, and then she'll melt." And the grandmother stroked his hair and told him stories. That same evening, after little Kay had gone home and was half undressed, he crept onto the chair by the window and peeped through the little round hole. Just then a few snowflakes fell outside, and one, the largest of them, remained lying on the edge of one of the flower pots. The snowflake grew larger and larger, and at last took the form of a lady dressed in the finest white silk, her robes made up of millions of star-like particles. She was exquisitely fair and delicate, but entirely made of ice, glittering, dazzling ice. Her eyes gleamed like two bright stars, but there was no rest or repose in them. She nodded at the window and beckoned with her hand. The little boy was frightened and jumped down from the chair to hide, but afterwards he thought he saw something like a large bird fly past the window. There was a clear frost next day, and soon afterwards spring came. The trees and flowers budded, the swallows built their nests, the windows were opened, and the little children sat once more in their little garden upon the gutter that ran along the roofs of the houses. That summer the roses blossomed so beautifully that the little girl learned a hymn in which there was something about roses. It reminded her of her own. So she sang it to the little boy, and he sang it with her. "Our roses bloom and fade away, our infant Lord abides away. May we be blessed his face to see, and ever little children be." And the children held each other by the hand, kissed the roses, and looked up into the blue sky, talking away all the time. What glorious summer days those were! How wonderful it was to sit under those rose trees, which looked as though they never intended to stop flowering. One day Kay and Gerda were sitting looking at the picture books full of birds and animals, when suddenly Kay exclaimed, "Oh dear, what was that shooting pain in my heart? And oh, something has gone into my eye!" The little girl turned and looked at him. He blinked his eyes. No, there was nothing to be seen. "I think it has gone," said he, but it had not. It was one of the glass splinters from the magic mirror, the wicked glass which made everything great and good appear little and hateful, and which magnified everything ugly and mean. Poor Kay had a splinter too in his heart, and it became cold and hard like a lump of ice. He no longer felt the pain, but the splinter was there. "Why are you crying?" he asked. "You look so ugly when you cry. There's nothing the matter with me. Oh," he exclaimed again, "this rose has an insect in it, and just look at this. They are ugly roses after all, and it is an ugly box they grow in." Then he kicked the box and tore off the roses. "Oh, Kay, what are you doing?" cried the little girl. But when he saw how it distressed her, he tore off another rose and jumped down through his own window, away from his once dear little Gerda. Ever afterwards, when she brought out the picture book, he called it a baby's book, and when her grandmother told stories, he interrupted her with a "but," and sometimes, whenever he could manage it, he would get behind her, put on her spectacles, and speak just as she did. He did this in a very droll manner, and so people laughed at him. Very soon he could mimic everybody in the street. All that was singular and awkward about them, Kay could imitate, and his neighbors said, "What a remarkable brain that boy has." But no, it was the glass splinter which had fallen into his eye, the glass splinter which had pierced his heart. It was these which made him regardless whose feelings he hurt, and even made him tease little Gerda. He played quite different games now from the ones he had before. One winter's day, when it snowed, he came out with a big magnifying glass and held it against the blue tail of his coat where the snowflakes fell on it. "Now look at the glass, Gerda," he said. Every flake of snow was magnified and looked like a splendid flower or 10-pointed star. "See how clever it is," Kay said. "That's much more interesting than real flowers, and the design is absolutely flawless." Soon after, he came in with thick gloves on his hands and his sledge slung across his back. He called out to Gerda, "I've got permission to drive on to the great square where the other boys are playing," and away he went. The boldest boys in the square used to fasten their sledges to the wagons of the country people and get pulled behind them, which was particularly good fun. While they were in the middle of the game, a large sledge painted white passed by, and in it sat a person wrapped in a rough white fur and wearing a rough white cap. When the sledge had driven twice around the square, Kay bound his little sledge to it and was carried on with it. On they went, faster and faster, into the next street. The person driving the sledge turned round and nodded kindly to Kay, just as if they were old friends. And every time Kay was going to lose his little sledge, the person turned and nodded again, as if to signify that he must stay. So Kay sat still, and they passed through the gates of the town. Then the snow began to fall so thickly that the little boy could not see his own hand, but he was still carried on. He tried hastily to undo the cords and free himself from the large sledge, but it was no use. It wouldn't come undone, and he was carried on, swift as the wind. And then he cried as loudly as he could, but no one heard him. The snow fell, and the sledge dashed on. Every now and then it sprang up as if it were bouncing over the top of the hedges and ditches. He was very frightened. He would have repeated "Our Father," but he could remember nothing but the multiplication tables. The snowflakes seemed to be getting larger and larger, till at last they looked like great white birds. All at once they parted. The large sledge stopped, and the person who drove it rose from the seat. Kay saw that the cap and coat were made entirely of snow, that the driver was a lady, tall and slender, and dazzlingly white. It was the Snow Queen. "We have driven fast," she said, "but no one likes to be frozen. Creep under my bearskin." And she seated him in the sledge by her side and spread her cloak around him. He felt as if he were sinking into a drift of snow. "Are you still cold?" asked she, and then she kissed his brow. Oh, her kiss was colder than ice. It went to his heart, although that was half frozen already, and he thought he should die. This feeling, however, only lasted for a moment. Directly afterwards he was quite well, and no longer felt the intense cold around. "My sledge! Do not forget my sledge!" He thought about that straight away, so they fastened it to one of the white birds which flew behind, with it on his back. The Snow Queen kissed Kay again, and he entirely forgot little Gerda, her grandmother, and everyone at home. "Now you must have no more kisses," said she, "or I shall kiss you to death." Kay looked at her. She was very beautiful. A more intelligent, more lovely countenance he could not imagine. She no longer appeared to him as cold as ice, as she had when she sat outside the window and beckoned to him. In his eyes she was perfect, and he now felt no fear. He told her how good he was at mental arithmetic, even with fractions, and how he knew the number of square miles of every country and the number of inhabitants in different towns. She smiled, and then it occurred to him that perhaps he did not yet know so very much after all. He looked up into the wide, wide space, and she flew with him high into the black cloud where the storm was raging, which seemed to Kay to be singing songs of olden times. They flew over woods and over lakes, over sea and over land. Beneath them the cold wind whistled, the wolves howled, the snow glittered, and the black crow flew cawing over the plain, but above them the moon shone cold and clear. Thus did Kay spend the long, long winter night, and all day he slept at the feet of the Snow Queen. The second story, The Enchanted Flower Garden. But how did little Gerda get on when Kay never returned? Where could he be? No one knew. The boys said they had seen him fasten his sledge to another larger and very handsome one, which had driven into the street and then swept through the gates of the town. No one knew where he was, and many tears were shed over him. Little Gerda wept and wept, for the boys said he must have been drowned in the river that flowed not far from the town. Oh, how long and dismal the winter days were now. At last the spring came, with its warm sunshine. Alas, Kay is dead and gone, said little Gerda. I do not believe it, said the sunshine. He is dead and gone, she said to the swallows. We do not believe it, they replied, and at last little Gerda herself did not believe it. I will put on my new red shoes, she said one morning, the ones which Kay has never seen, and then I will go down to the river and ask after him. It was quite early. She kissed her old grandmother, who was still sleeping, put on her red shoes, and went alone through the gates of the town toward the river. Is it true, said she, that you have taken my little playfellow away? I will give you my red shoes if you will give him back to me. And the waves of the river flowed toward her in a strange way, so she thought that they were going to accept her offer. She took off her red shoes, though she prized them more than anything else she possessed, and threw them into the stream. But the little waves bore them back to her, as though they would not take them from her, because they had not got little Kay. However, she thought she had not thrown the shoes far enough, so she stepped into a little boat which lay among the reeds by the shore, and, standing at the farthest end of it, threw them far into the water. The boat was not fastened, and the movements inside it made it glide away from the shore. Seeing this, she hurried to the other end, but by the time she reached it, it was more than a yard from the land. She could not escape, and the boat moved on. Little Gerda was much frightened and began to cry, but no one besides the sparrows heard her. They could not carry her back to the land, but they flew along the banks and sang, as if to comfort her, Here we are, here we are. The boat followed the stream. Perhaps the river will take me to Kay, she thought, and then she became more cheerful and amused herself for hours by looking at the lovely countryside around her. At last she glided past a large cherry orchard, in which was a little cottage with a thatched roof and curious red and blue windows. 2 wooden soldiers stood at the door, and they presented arms when they saw the little vessel approach. Gerda called to them, thinking they were alive, but naturally enough they made no answer. She came close up to them, for the stream carried the boat toward the land. She called still louder, and an old lady came out of the house, supporting herself on a crutch. She wore a large hat with the most beautiful flowers painted on it. Poor little child, said the old woman, the mighty river has indeed brought you a long way. And she walked right into the water, seized the boat with her crutch, drew it to land, and took the little girl out. Gerda was glad to be on dry land again, although she was a little afraid of the strange old lady. Come and tell me who you are, and how you came here, said she. So Gerda told her everything, and the old lady shook her head and said, And when Gerda asked if she had seen little Kay, the lady said that he had not arrived there yet, but that he would be sure to come soon, and in the meantime Gerda must not be too sad. She could stay with her and eat her cherries and look at her flowers, which were prettier than any picture book, and would each tell her a story. Then she took her by the hand, and they went together into the cottage, and the old lady shut the door. The windows were very high and had panes of different colored glass, so that when the bright daylight streamed through them, various and beautiful colors filtered into the room. A plate of very fine cherries was placed on a table in the center, and Gerda was allowed to eat as many as she liked. While she was eating them, the old dame combed her hair with a golden comb, and the bright flaxen ringlets fell on each side of her pretty, gentle face, which looked as round and as fresh as a rose. I have long wished for a dear little girl like you, said the old lady. We will see if we can live very happily together. And, as she combed little Gerda's hair, the child thought less and less of Kay, for the old lady was an enchantress. She did not, however, practice magic for the sake of mischief, but merely for her own amusement. Now she wanted very much to keep little Gerda to live with her, and, fearing that if Gerda saw her roses, she would be reminded of her own flowers and of little Kay, she went out into the garden, waved her crutch over all her rose bushes, and although they were covered with leaves and blossoms, they immediately sank into the black earth. Then she led Gerda into this garden. Flowers of all seasons and all climates grew there in profusion. Certainly no picture book could be compared with it. Gerda danced with delight and played among the flowers till the sun set behind the cherry trees. Then a little bed, with crimson silk cushions and a mattress stuffed with blue violet leaves, was made ready, and she slept sweetly there and had dreams such as a queen might have on her bridal eve. The next day she played again among the flowers in the warm sunshine, and she spent many more days in the same manner. She knew every flower in the garden, but, numerous as they were, it seemed to her that one was missing, though she could not tell which. Then one day she was sitting looking at her hostess's hat, which was the one with the flowers painted on it, and behold, the loveliest among them was a rose. The old lady had entirely forgotten about it. "Why," cried Gerda, "there are no roses in the garden!" She ran from one bed to another, looking everywhere, but no rose was to be found. She sat down and wept, and it so happened that her tears fell on a spot where a rose tree had formerly stood. As soon as her warm tears had moistened the earth, the bush sprang up again, as fresh as it was before it had sunk into the ground. Gerda threw her arms round it, kissed the flowers, and immediately remembered Kay. "Oh, how could I stay here so long?" she exclaimed. "I left home to look for Kay. Do you know where he is?" she asked of the roses. "Is he dead?" "He is not dead," said the roses. "We have been down in the earth. The dead are there, but not Kay." "Thank you," said little Gerda, and she went to the other flowers and asked, "Do you know where little Kay is?" But every flower stood in the sunshine, dreaming its own little dream. They told their stories to Gerda, but none of them knew anything about Kay. So away she ran to the end of the garden. The gate was closed, but she pressed down upon the rusty lock till it broke. The gate sprang open, and little Gerda ran barefooted out into the wide world. She looked back 3 times. There was no one following her. She ran till she could run no longer, and then she sat down upon a large stone. Looking round, she saw that summer was over, and it was now late in the autumn. She had not noticed this in the enchanted garden, where there was sunshine and flowers all the year round. "How long I must have stayed there," said little Gerda. "So it's autumn now. Well then, there is no time to lose," and she rose to go on her way. Oh, how sore and weary her little feet were, and everything round about looked so cold and barren. The long willow leaves had already turned yellow, and the dew trickled down from them like water. The leaves fell off the trees one by one. The sloe alone bore fruit, and its berries were sharp and bitter. Cold and gray and sad the world seemed that day. The third story, The Prince and the Princess. Gerda soon had to stop and rest again. Suddenly a large raven hopped upon the snow in front of her, saying, "Caw, caw, good day, good day." He sat for some time on the withered branch of a tree just opposite, eyeing the little maiden and wagging his head. Then he came forward to talk to her and ask her where she was going all alone. Gerda told the raven the story of her life and fortunes, and asked if he had seen Kay. And the raven nodded his head half doubtedly and said, "That is possible. "Do you think so?" exclaimed the little girl, and she hugged the raven so enthusiastically that it is a wonder she did not squeeze him to death. "Gently, gently," said the raven. "I think I know. I think it may be little Kay, but he has certainly forsaken you for the princess." "Does he live with a princess?" asked Gerda. "Listen to me," said the raven. "But it is so difficult to speak your language. Do you understand Ravenish? If so, I can tell you much better." "No, I have never learned Ravenish," said Gerda, "but my grandmother knew it. Oh, how I wish I had learnt it from her." "Never mind," said the raven. "I will tell you as best I can. In the kingdom where we are now there dwells an uncommonly clever princess. Immediately after she came to the throne, she began to sing a new song, the burden of which was this: 'Why should I not marry me?' There is some sense in this song," said she, and she determined she would marry, but declared that the man whom she would choose must be able to answer sensibly whenever people spoke to him, and must be good for something else besides merely looking grand and stately. "Believe me," continued the raven, "every word I say is true, for I have a sweetheart who hops about the palace as she pleases, and she has told me all this." Proclamations adorned with borders of hearts were immediately issued, proclaiming that every well-favored youth was free to go to the palace, and that whoever should talk and show himself intelligent and at ease with the princess would be the one she would choose for her husband. The people all crowded to the palace, but it was all no use. The young men could speak well enough while they were outside the palace gates, but when they went in and saw the royal guard in silver uniform, and the lackeys on the staircase in gold, and the spacious rooms all lighted up, they were quite confounded. They stood before the throne where the princess sat, and when she spoke to them, they could only repeat the last words she had uttered. It was just as though they had been struck dumb the moment they entered the palace, for as soon as they got out, they could talk fast enough. There was a regular procession constantly moving from the gates of the town to the gates of the palace. "But Kay, little Kay, when did he come?" asked Gerda. "Was he among the crowd?" Presently, we have just come to him." On the third day arrived a youth with neither horse nor carriage. Gaily he marched up the palace. His eyes sparkled like yours. He had long, beautiful hair, but he was very meanly clad. "That was Kay!" exclaimed Gerda. "Oh, then I have found him!" And she clapped her hands with delight. "He carried a knapsack on his back," said the raven. "No, not a knapsack," said Gerda. "A sledge, for he had a sledge with him when he left home." "It is possible," rejoined the raven. "I did not look very closely, but I heard from my beloved that when he entered the palace gates, and saw the royal guard in silver, and the lackeys in gold upon the staircase, he did not seem in the least confused. He nodded pleasantly and said to them, 'It must be very tedious standing out there. I prefer going in.'" The halls glistened with light. Cabinet councilors and lords-in-waiting were walking about barefoot and carrying golden keys. It was just the place to make a man solemn and silent, and the youth's boots creaked horribly, yet he was not at all afraid. "That certainly was Kay," said Gerda. "I know he had new boots. I have heard them creak in my grandmother's room." "They really did make a noise," said the raven, "but he went merrily up to the princess, who was waiting upon a pearl as large as a spinning wheel. All the ladies of the court, the maids of honor, and their handmaidens stood ranged in order on one side, and all the gentlemen in waiting, with their gentlemen, and their gentlemen's gentlemen, who also kept pages, stood arranged in order on the other side, and the nearer they were to the door, the prouder they looked. The young man spoke as well as I speak when I converse in Ravenish. He was handsome and lively. He did not come to woo her, he said. He had only come to hear the wisdom of the princess, and he liked her much, and she liked him in return." "Yes, to be sure, that was Kay," said Gerda. "He was so clever. He could do arithmetic in his head, even fractions. Oh, will you take me to the palace?" "Ah, that is easily said," replied the raven. "But how is it to be done?" "I will talk it over with my sweetheart. She will advise us what to do, for I must tell you that such a little girl as you will never get permission to enter publicly." "Yes, I shall," cried Gerda. "When Kay knows that I am here, he will immediately come out and fetch me." "Wait for me at the trellis over there," said the raven. He wagged his head, and away he flew. He did not return till late in the evening. "Caw, caw," he said. "My sweetheart greets you kindly, and sends you a piece of bread which she took from the kitchen. There is plenty of bread there, and you must certainly be hungry. As you have bare feet, the royal guard in silver uniform and the lackeys in gold would never permit you to enter the palace. But do not weep, you shall go there. My sweetheart knows a little back staircase leading to the bedrooms, and she also knows where to find the key." So they went into the garden and down the grand avenue, and when the lights in the palace had been extinguished one by one, the raven took Gerda to a back door which stood half open. Oh, how Gerda's heart beat with fear and expectation! It was just as though she was about to do something wrong, although she only wanted to know whether Kay was really there. She would see if his smile was the same as it used to be when they sat together under the rose trees. He would be so glad to see her, to hear how far she had come for his sake, and how everyone at home mourned his absence. Her heart trembled with fear and joy as she went on. They climbed the staircase. A small lamp placed on a cabinet gave a glimmer of light, and on the floor stood the tame raven, who first turned her head on all sides, and then looked at Gerda, who made her curtsy as her grandmother had taught her. "My betrothed has told me about you, my good young maiden," said the tame raven. Your adventures, too, are extremely interesting. If you will take the lamp, I will show you the way. We are going straight on. We won't meet anyone now." They entered the first room. Its walls were covered with rose-colored satin and embroidered with gold flowers. Some dreams rustled past them, but with such rapidity that Gerda could not see them. Each room that they went through vied with the next in splendor, until at last they reached the sleeping hall. In the center of this room stood a pillar of gold, like the stem of a large palm tree, whose leaves of costly glass fashioned the ceiling. Hanging down from the tree on thick golden stalks were 2 beds in the form of lilies. One was white, and in it rested the princess. The other was red, and in it Gerda hoped to find her playfellow Kay. She bent aside one of the red leaves and saw a brown neck. Oh, it must be Kay! She called him by his name aloud and held the lamp close to him. The dreams rushed by. He awoke, turned his head, but behold, it was not Kay. The princess looked out from under the white lily petals and asked what was the matter. Then little Gerda wept and told her the whole story and what the ravens had done for her. "Oh, you poor child," said the prince and princess, and then they praised the ravens and said they were not angry with them, but that they weren't to do it again. This once, however, they should be rewarded. "Would you like to fly away freely to the woods?" asked the princess, addressing the ravens, "or would you rather have appointments as court ravens, with the perquisites belonging to the kitchen, such as crumbs and leavings?" And both the ravens bowed low and chose the appointment at court, for they thought of old age, and said it would be so comfortable to be well provided for in their declining years. Then the prince rose and made Gerda sleep in his bed. The next day she was dressed from head to foot in silk and velvet. She was invited to stay at the palace and enjoy all sorts of diversions, but she begged only for a carriage and a horse, and a pair of little boots. All she wanted was to go back into the wide world to look for Kay. They gave her the boots and a muff besides, and as soon as she was ready there drove up to the door a carriage of pure gold, with the arms of the prince and princess glittering like a star, and whose coachman, footmen, and outriders all wore gold crowns. The princess and prince themselves helped her into the carriage and wished her success, and the wood raven, who was now married, accompanied her the first 3 miles. The carriage was well provided with sugar plums, fruit, and gingerbread nuts. "Farewell, farewell!" cried the prince and princess. Little Gerda wept, and the raven wept out of sympathy. Then he flew up to the branch of a tree and flapped his black wings at the coach till it was out of sight. And that's where we are going to leave off for today, and we will read the other half of that on Friday. Have a good afternoon, everyone.